Picture, if you will, a world where imagination knew no limits, where the visions of Imagineers stretched beyond budgets and outlasted boardroom decisions. A kingdom of ideas too bold for their time, preserved only in sketches and forgotten blueprints. Welcome to The Never Was. Main Street USA has always been a window to America's past, but when it came to building a new park that was meant to rival and surpass every other Disney kingdom around the globe, Imagineers set out to reimagine the street that greets every visitor. This was not turn-of-the-century America, but the Roaring Twenties, a place where jazz echoed from rooftops, automobiles lined the curbs, and bold architecture told a new story of progress and promise. A version of Main Street that would never see the light of day. But tonight, our story takes us there. Main Street USA was an opening day land in Disneyland, designed to evoke nostalgia and drawing from Walt Disney's own past. Inspired by Marceline, Missouri, Harper Goff created this small town from scratch, a place that, according to its backstory, had rapidly grown thanks to the arrival of the railroad, just as countless towns once did across America. All around the land, details immerse you in its world. Gas lamps giving way to electric light, storefronts caught between eras. Even now, it still manages to evoke that same nostalgia, even for people born nearly a century after the time it represents. It has remained one of the least changed lands in Disneyland's 70-year history, a quiet testament to how successful the original vision was. When it came time to building a second Magic Kingdom in Florida, Walt's brother Roy did not reinvent a wheel. Main Street kept the same promise, only this time it delivered in size. With a vast Florida property, Walt's dreams finally had room to grow, and even Main Street reflected that ambition. A few years later, Disney set its sights overseas with Tokyo Disneyland. With Imagineers busy completing Epcot Center, much of Tokyo's park borrowed directly from earlier designs. But one striking change came at the entrance. Main Street itself was missing, replaced by World Bazaar. It captured the same spirit and architecture, but here it stretched beneath a glass canopy from end to end. A practical choice to shelter guests from the weather, but also a compromise that never quite lived up to the ideal. And then came a new era. With Michael Eisner and Frank Wells taking the reins, the company looked to Europe. Their vision to carry Americana across the Atlantic, creating a park both familiar and strange, a Magic Kingdom at a scale never before attempted. Euro Disney was a massive undertaking, but at its heart stood the Euro Disneyland Park. When it came to design, Tony Baxter was chosen to lead the creative teams. Each land would be entrusted to its own lead Imagineer, and for tonight's story, that Imagineer was Eddie Sato. At a meeting with Baxter, Sato had shared details from a project he was developing for Six Flags, an attraction alive with wiring steampunk machinery and heavy with Jules Verne influence. On paper, he seemed destined to Discoveryland, but fate had other plans. That role went instead to Tim Delaney. Sato, meanwhile, was handed a different assignment, show producer of Main Street USA. And in March of 1987, development on Euro Disneyland officially begun, and with it, imagination was allowed to run wild. The Disneyland Hotel would be a later addition, so originally the idea was to have a more traditional entrance, much like the Magic Kingdom or Disneyland. The first thing guests would see after showing their tickets was the Main Street station of the railroad, a staple attraction dating back to the very first plans for Disneyland. This was the real entrance to the park. It was here that guests left the real world behind and stepped into a world of fantasy, adventure, and discovery. But this version of Main Street was unlike any that came before. While it was set in the 1920s, it carried with it echoes of the turn-of-the-century towns found in the other parks. In this story, the town was changing, evolving with the times. Some buildings recalled the familiar architecture of Walt Disney World, while others embraced bold Art Deco lines and details that pushed the timeline forward. And then, stepping under the train station and into Town Square, the difference became impossible to miss. Off to the right, where the Main Street Transportation Company stands today, rose an elevated train. Inspired by the design seen in Hello Dolly, this L train acted as almost an extension of the train station, though it wasn't directly connected. Guests could board here in Town Square and ride it down Main Street all the way to Discoveryland, where a massive transportation hub linked both the L train and the Euro Disneyland Railroad. From there, the line looped back, this time running down inside one of the arcades. The L train set the tone for everything that followed. This was a Main Street on a scale like none other. Taller buildings, brighter lights, layers of movement and advertising, a street alive with detail, bursting with the energy of the jazz age. Like Tokyo, the weather was a big issue that Imagineers had to take into consideration. Every land needed some kind of protection from the rain and cold, and Main Street was no exception. But while Tokyo Disneyland solved the problem with a massive glass canopy that covered the entire street, Paris would go in a different direction. Instead, Imagineers designed two arcades running along each side of Main Street. These would not only shelter guests, but also create entirely new experiences to discover, each with its own story to tell. On the right side, the arcade led toward Discoveryland and shared its space with the L train, which also made use of the shelter. Inside, the town stayed alive with motion. Windows displayed models of different cities of the future, tying the land's jazz age optimism to the progress waiting just ahead. This detail, in a slightly different form, would eventually carry over into the Main Street we know today. On the left side, another covered passage stretched the length of the street, filled with its own secrets and entrances to explore. More than just shortcuts, these arcades helped Main Street feel like a real, living town, one that was constantly moving. Along with the railroad and the L train came automobiles and taxis, carrying guests through the street, adding yet another layer of life and energy. But the most important addition, the one that would finally transform Main Street from being seen as just the entrance to the park into a true land of its own, was attractions. And for this version of Main Street, attractions were very much a part of the plan. There were several attractions planned in addition to the already discussed L train, the railroad, and the taxi rides that would feature cars from the time, even limousines. The first of these was the 360-degree theater, a circle vision show. Since this was developed before the concept of a second park took shape, Hollywood was set to make its entrance here on Main Street in the form of the Hollywood Movie Palace. This was no ordinary building. Limousines would pull up right to its entrance, guests stepping out as if they were movie stars attending a silent movie premiere. The facade took direct inspiration from the Los Angeles Theater, while the interior was an Art Deco fan's dream. A grand waiting hall would feature displays and intricate details to explore before guests moved into the main theater itself, where a 360-degree film would tell the history of Hollywood and early cinema. Eventually, the idea was reworked into a more traditional theater concept, since the development of Disney MGM Studios Europe meant Imagineers wanted to avoid overlapping themes. But Main Street in the 1920s couldn't just be about Hollywood glitz. It also carried the shadow of Prohibition, an era that gave rise to hidden speakeasies across the United States. Eddie Sauter knew this was something the land couldn't miss, and so he developed the Afterlife. From the street, it appeared to be nothing more than a Triple Bros funeral parlor. But step inside, whisper the password, "We're the family" to the funeral director, and you'd be escorted to view a coffin. At that moment, the hidden turntable would rotate, revealing a fabulous Art Deco nightclub. Inside, guests could enjoy dinner and a dazzling jazz show, until, at the climax of the night, the lights would flash and the police would storm in. Every guest would be arrested and escorted out, the raid itself was serving as the show's unforgettable finale. There were other iterations of this idea, such as Capone's Jazz Club, that would use a flower shop as its facade, but in the end, they all served the same concept: a speakeasy right under the police's nose. Being Main Street, it couldn't miss the many dining and shopping opportunities, and it certainly did not. Along the street and in both arcades, countless detailed establishments could be seen and entered. The Nighthawk's Diner, inspired by Edward Hopper's painting, offered coffee, snacks, and conversation, letting guests watch the L train glide overhead while neon lights shimmered from the movie palace. The Automat restaurant provided self-service, coin-operated dining with freshly prepared food at an affordable price, a novel concept that fit perfectly into this ever-changing town. The Sicilian deli served deep dish pizza, the French bakery offered croissants and pastries, and the candy store promised a sweet treat. Shopping here also told stories of its own. The dark room stocked photography supplies. Walt's Hobbies offered model trains and miniature objects. Manhattan Jewelers provided fine watches and jewelry. The Grand Emporium, a large department store, remained, but the smaller, highly detailed shops gave Main Street a richness and life that contrasts sharply with a more generic shopping experience in today's parks. If something like the Nighthawk's Diner or the Speakeasy wasn't enough, this version of Main Street would also feature a Club 33 style location. Near the land's entrance in Town Square, the Main Street Transportation Company hides a secret establishment. While normal visitors explore the main hall, featuring exhibits on transportation, legendary trains, and even a working model of Euro Disneyland, a hidden passage led lucky guests into a private terminal. Inside, a train heavily inspired by the 20th Century Limited carried them on a culinary journey through America. To keep the land feeling alive, entertainment and small theatrics were everywhere, like in Manhattan Jewelers, where stage robberies would occur, with police rushing to resolve the situations in playful, comic ways. Eddie Sato and his team spent over a year dedicated to this vision, developing every minute detail and storyline. But as they worked, constraints and doubts began to mount, most notably from someone who couldn't easily be ignored: Michael Eisner. He felt the theme had strayed too far from the proven Main Street formula and worried that the concept leaned too heavily on mature elements: alcohol, stage shootouts, and the party atmosphere of the 1920s. In the end, the project was completely reworked, replaced by a more traditional Main Street. Some ideas found their way into the park we know today, while others traveled abroad, finding a home in Tokyo's second park. Eddie remained as show producer, ensuring that this version of Main Street became the most detailed, rich, and immersive Disney had ever created, a version still enjoyed by guests more than 30 years later. Not long after Euro Disneyland opened, Michael Eisner turned to Eddie Sato with a quiet admission that perhaps they should have gone with his bold vision of a 1920s Main Street, that audiences would have loved it. But of course, by then, it was too late. A Hollywood palace of dreams, a nightclub hidden behind coffins, a Main Street alive with jazz, limousines, and the pulse of the 1920s. But all of it remained on paper, erased by compromise, timing, and the shifting tides of history. A land that lived only in sketches and blueprints. A land that now only survives in the never was. While this chapter comes to an end, the story is far from over. Beyond Main Street, Imagineers dreamed of an entire city of invention, a Discoveryland straight from the imagination of Jules Verne. Next time, we'll step into the Discoveryland that may never be discovered. And so, thank you for watching, and that's a wrap.